Thank you very much, Cassandra. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I would like to begin by thanking the European Chamber of Commerce in Korea for arranging this event. As you may be aware, over the last few weeks, there have been a lot of events around the world around climate change. So we have COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, but also the G20 happening in Indonesia. What I'm going to try to do over the next 30 minutes or so, very briefly go over the decarbonization policies that various G20 countries have and compare them to each other, in particular with a focus around comparing Europe and Korea. As Cassandra kindly introduced me, I come from Bloomberg NEF. Bloomberg NEF, or BNEF, is the research division within Bloomberg, looking at all the different aspects of energy transition. The presentation I'll be showing you is based on analysis that my colleagues around the world do. If you're interested in the content, by all means, please feel free to reach out through the ECCK colleagues. Many of the slides I will be showing also are publicly available. If you would like to search a Climate Policy Fact Book 2022, you'll be able to find the reference material. Of course, again, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. So let me start by first highlighting the scale of the challenge that we face today. The two charts you're looking at here show you the greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution. On your left, you've got the greenhouse gas emissions annually by share of the source of the emissions. And then on the right, you've got the absolute values. A few things to point out on what you're looking at. The first one is, as you can see on the absolute values chart, the numbers start rising after the Industrial Revolution, and that growth rate accelerates significantly in the aftermath of World War II. So as the world had relative peace after World War II, that economic growth powered by fossil fuels resulted in more greenhouse gas emissions. And then you can see that growth rate accelerates again in the 1990s. Particularly, you can see colors in red and yellow come up. So the red being China, and then the yellow, which is non-Annex I countries. These are emerging markets that started liberalizing in the 1990s and had very high growth rates, resulting in emissions growth. Now, right off the bat, unfortunately, there are a few nomenclatures that come up. Many of you in the audience may be familiar with them, just for making sure that you're all familiar with them. When I say non-Annex I, this is a reference to the Kyoto Protocol that was signed in 1997. The Kyoto Protocol was the first sort of climate change agreement around emission reduction. Back then, they divided the countries into two groups: the Annex I countries, which was primarily OECD members, so developed economies. These are countries such as UK, Germany, Japan. These were countries that were required to reduce emissions under the Kyoto Protocol. Non-Annex I countries were developing economies, which at that time Korea was considered one, and these non-Annex I countries under the Kyoto Protocol were not required to reduce emissions. I'll come back to this point later on and to highlight why it's important to actually recognize these differences. Now, as you can see, the greenhouse gas emissions have now grown to be close to annually around 50 gigatons per year. If you look at the cumulative share of emissions, developed economies, particularly the US, have the lion's share. So the US cumulative share of emissions since the Industrial Revolution is about 21%. And of course, fast-growing economies, most notably China, have also emerged as significant emitters. And now China is annually the largest emitter, and then historically, on a cumulative basis, is actually number 3 if you include EU as a whole. Accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, as many of you are already familiar, is what causes global warming. And the latest assessment that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published last summer, August 2021, concluded that the average global surface temperature has already risen by 1.1 degrees relative to pre-industrial levels. Now, this is the average globally. This number is actually higher in certain areas. For example, Australia is already on average experiencing 1.5. You may think these numbers are relatively small, but unfortunately, even these levels of temperature change causes massive weather impacts in the form of more frequent floods as well as droughts. Now, you may remember that back in 2015, when the world came together in Paris to sign on to the Paris Agreement, the goal that countries agreed was to limit the global average surface temperature rise by the end of this century to well below 2 degrees and if possible 1.5 degrees. That 1.5 degrees stretch goal was quite important, and it was quite an ingenious move by the Paris, the COP21 coordinators, so the French government and their partners, in including that, because basically that gave the impetus for the IPCC to then go out and actually find out what would be required to hit a 1.5 degrees target. In 2018, they published a report on what would be required, and their conclusion was twofold. One, we would have to hit peak emissions as soon as possible, and two, we would have to reach net zero emissions by sometime by this mid-century to be able to hit that 1.5 degrees target. Now, the timing of that net zero target is very much dependent on when we hit peak emissions. The earlier we hit the peak emissions, the more time we have for net zero. The later we hit peak emissions, the earlier we'll have to hit the net zero target. After the IPCC report came out in 2018, then we started to see countries announce net zero targets. Initially, this was led by, again, developed economies, for example, the UK, New Zealand, Canada. These were first out of the gate in announcing net zero targets. In 2020, during the UN General Assembly in September, China's President Xi announced that China would target carbon neutrality before 2060. A few weeks after that, the Japanese Prime Minister at the time announced a net zero by 2050 target, and then days later, Korea's president at the time announced a net zero by 2050 target. One thing to note, you hear the terms net zero and carbon neutrality quite often as well. Unfortunately, in media, it's common to use these terms interchangeably. Actually, they have different meanings. Usually when governments use the term carbon neutrality, they're only talking about CO2. Whereas when countries talk about net zero emissions, they're usually talking about all greenhouse gases. This is an important distinguishing factor because there are other greenhouse gases beyond CO2. CO2, of course, is very important, but other greenhouse gases like methane are also quite important to consider. If you look at the state of these sort of long-term decarbonization targets as of now, about 90% of greenhouse gas emissions are already covered by these sort of long-term decarbonization targets. Now, to be fair, not all of these targets have been legislated. Some, such as the UK one or the EU level ones, have been legislated. Korea has also legislated its net zero by 2050 target. But others, such as China's target or India's announcement during the last COP last year in Glasgow, these are government positions. Among the G20 members, there are 3 key members that don't still have a formal official target. Those are Russia and Turkey, as well as the US. The US, to be fair, the Biden administration has talked about net zero by 2050, but given the challenges in terms of domestic politics, they haven't actually formally introduced a target. Now, if you want to achieve net zero emissions, of course, we have to consider where the emissions are coming from. The pie charts you're looking at on the right, this shows you the greenhouse gas emissions by their primary source. And so you can see that power, industry, and transport dominate greenhouse gases as sources. There are, of course, other sources of emissions, particularly around our agricultural and land use practices. Those are quite important. In the interest of time, I'm going to primarily focus around what are considered energy-related emissions. So these are basically emissions associated with combustion of fossil fuels for energy use. These emissions account for just over 70% of greenhouse gases. The other 30%, of course, is quite important as well. And if there are questions, I'll be happy to come back to them at the end of the talk. Speaking of fossil fuel emissions, so as you can see on the area chart on your left, these are basically the emissions associated for when we combust oil, gas, and coal for our energy usage. If you want to get rid of these emissions, the primary approach we can utilize is to increase the share of use of electricity in final energy use. So for example, in the case of transportation, as much as possible, change from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles. In the case of heating in buildings, for example, switch to electric heat pumps. In the case of industrial processes where applicable, for example, switch to using electric arc furnaces in producing steel. And then make sure that that electricity is coming from clean sources. That could be renewables, could be nuclear, or it could be, even if possible, applying carbon capture and storage to thermal power plants. Now, there will certainly be certain areas that we cannot directly electrify. So if you think about long distance aviation or marine transport, or primary steel production, in some cases, we will still need to use other types of energy sources. In those cases, we can still look into producing clean fuels from clean electricity. For example, you hear a lot about green hydrogen, i.e. producing hydrogen from electrolysis by breaking down water, with that electrolysis process being powered by clean electricity. Now, the good news is all the technologies that I spoke about are receiving quite a significant amount of investments. We've been tracking investment in energy transition technologies since 2004. And you can see that annually that investment amount has been growing. So last year, there was over $755 billion invested in deployment of these technologies. The lion's share is going to deployment of renewable power plants, so solar farms, wind farms. Electric vehicle sales are also rapidly growing, and the investment in charging infrastructure is also increasing. Apologies. If you look at the other technologies, such as hydrogen or CCS or nuclear, particularly next generation nuclear, they're getting a lot of attention, but in terms of the actual investment in deployment volumes is still relatively limited. It's starting to grow, but you can see that it's still on this chart. The numbers look quite small. On the renewable side, we have seen significant progress over the last decade. What this chart is showing you is the share of annual capacity additions globally by technology. You can look at back in 2010, coal power plants and gas power plants accounted for about 60% of the capacity growth. You can see that in 2020, that number was flipped, where solar and wind were now dominating that role that coal and gas were playing. For 2021, the combination of solar and wind alone accounted for 75% of capacity additions. The growth in deployment of renewable power plants, as well as scale up of manufacturing, has had a massive impact on reducing the cost of these technologies. So for solar modules, we've seen the average module price decline by about 89% over the last decade. For onshore wind turbines, just over 50%, and for lithium-ion batteries, which are more driven by the EV market, similarly on a pack level, an 89% decline. Now, it's not just that these technologies are getting cheaper, they're also getting better. So if you look at your solar module efficiencies, in the case of monocrystalline silicon, we've now gone from just under 16% to over 20%. This number may seem relatively low. Those of you who are in the business of building power plants and developing projects, you know that every single percentage point increase in the efficiency has a massive impact around the financial performance of your project. For onshore wind, it's not just that the turbines are getting better, although they are getting better, but the developers and operators are also getting much better at siting them and operating them. So the downtime has been reduced. Manufacturers have gotten better at developing turbines that are more suitable for different wind speeds. For lithium-ion batteries, there are different classifications within lithium-ion batteries, but across the world, we've seen improvements in energy density as well as life cycle and power density as well. If you look at building a new power plant today, in many countries around the world, if you're just looking at calculating the levelized cost of electricity by technology, in many areas, either solar or wind is the cheapest source of new electricity. Just as a definition, when I say LCOE, what I'm talking about, or levelized cost of electricity, I'm talking about taking into account all the capital expenditure associated with building a power plant, including its financing costs, as well as taking into account its operational and fuel costs, over the assumed project lifetime, and then looking at what would have to be the levelized power purchase agreement that that power plant receives for the equity investor to meet its IRR expectations. I apologize for the long explanation. An LCOE is a very good measure if you're looking at it from the perspective of the equity investor. Of course, there are other considerations when it comes if you're looking at from a system balancing perspective. On an LCOE basis, you can see that in much of the world, either solar, shown in yellow, or wind, shown in blue, is the cheapest form of electricity. You will notice that particularly here in Asia Pacific, there are some areas such as Indonesia, Japan, and Korea, where the black in coal is still the cheapest form. The reason here is not just due to geography, but actually this is also partly driven by power market regulations. You can see that, for example, in India, which similar to Indonesia has a lot of cheap domestic coal, still solar is cheaper. The reason there is that India has done a good job of ensuring that a domestic solar project scale up has happened. They've put an auction process in place, which has essentially driven cost reduction and scale up of deployment. In the cases of markets such as Indonesia or here in Korea, unfortunately, current power market regulations really limit. And in the case of Korea, inadvertently, the existing RPS mechanism also ends up having some impacts around inflationary pressure around solar project deployment. I'd be happy to talk about this more if there's a question later on. Now, many of you, of course, are aware that we've been going through an inflation crisis even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We were seeing that the uneven recovery from the pandemic was having an impact around both freight costs as well as labor costs and some of the input raw material costs into power plant deployment. When we compared the levelized cost of electricity numbers for the first half of this year with the first half of last year, we were seeing across the board increases. To be fair, those increases were actually worse for thermal power plants, because we saw in the thermal power plants, it wasn't just the capex that went up. More importantly, their fuel costs have gone significantly higher. So the competitiveness of renewables versus thermal power plants actually during the current energy crisis has improved. In a way, to simplify, renewables are even more competitive because they don't have that dependence on fossil fuels that thermal power plants have. In fact, if you look at the short-run marginal cost of existing thermal power plants and compare that with the LCOE of new renewables, in some areas of the world, you can see that the LCOE of the new renewable is even below the cost of running the existing thermal power plant. Of course, this is not the case in everywhere. So, for example, in the US, which has very cheap domestic coal, running the coal power plants is still cheaper than building a new renewable power plant. Similarly, in the case of Indonesia. I went a little bit on a side note on the technology progress because I wanted to highlight that we're making a lot of progress on technologies. The challenge, of course, is that we're running out of time in terms of our carbon budget. What I mean by the carbon budget is, as we discussed at the beginning, when we talk about the temperature change, we're really talking about the accumulation of emissions over time. So when countries talk about net zero by a certain date, it's not just that when we hit that net zero target, but it's important how we hit it. So what's the trend line between now and that point? You can see on this chart, I'm showing you 4 different lines that all end in net zero by 2050, but they actually imply very different temperature rises by the end of the century. If we gradually reduce emissions towards net zero by 2050, then we might hit 2 degrees. If you want to hit 1.5 degrees, we actually have to accelerate emission reduction right away. And then if you look at the black line, which is showing you the trajectory that we're currently on purely on economic basis, so no policy action, then you're seeing that we're looking at more of a 3.3 degrees type of target. Now, you would be aware that under the Paris Agreement, countries actually propose their own 2030 emission reduction targets. And the UNFCCC has been doing an assessment of those targets. So the first assessment was done right after Paris Agreement, so in April of 2016, you can see on the screen here. At that point, the cumulative 2030 emission targets that countries had submitted would imply that emissions in 2030 would be about 11.1% higher than 2019. By November 2021, so the conclusion of COP26 in Glasgow, that the targets have been a little bit better. So we were looking at 4.7%. And now at the conclusion of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, we're looking at around just 0.3% rise. So it's an improvement, but the challenge is if you look at the lines on this chart below, where we need to be in 2030 is actually well below emission levels in 2019. If we want to keep 2 degrees alive, we have to be at least 23% below 2019 levels by 2030. If we want to hit 1.5 degrees, then we have to be well below 40% emission reduction by 2030 relative to 2019 levels. Unfortunately, not all governments have set emission reduction targets by 2030 that would be as ambitious. If you look at the G20, so a few of them have. For EU across the whole, it's fairly close to a 1.5 degree, although it's 39%, needs to be a little bit higher than that. If you look at here in Asia Pacific, you can see that with the exception of Australia, the rest of the APAC members of G20 actually have much more modest targets. Now, this is where things get tricky and the whole Annex 1, non-Annex 1 debate comes up. Many countries, particularly developing economies such as Indonesia and India, would argue that actually the US and Europe should do a lot more because they have been historically responsible for past emissions. And there's some truth to that, given that just under half of emissions would actually be the combination of US and Europe as a whole. On the other hand, the challenge is, of course, China, India, and Indonesia are rising emitters. And if they don't control their emissions rise within this decade, then even if the US and Europe do a lot of aggressive action, then that might not be enough. This is one of the really challenging items when it comes to climate change negotiations. There's a common term that's used called CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities. There has been some progress on this topic, but still it is one of the challenging items that comes up at every COP. Now, of course, one thing is setting targets. The other one is, are these countries actually making progress in hitting these targets? If you look at the countries here, particularly the ones that have actually very, very weak targets, such as India, China, Turkey, in reality, they're actually already on much better trajectories than what their targets imply. So we don't expect, for example, India's emissions to rise by 63% by 2030 relative to 2019. We actually expect it to do relatively better than what its NDC says. On the other hand, if you look at Japan and South Korea's emission reduction targets by 2030, even though it's nice that they've set 2-degree compliant targets, the trajectory they're on right now is not enough to actually hit these targets. So they've essentially set much more ambitious targets than they've implemented policies to hit them. Speaking of policies, every year we go through an assessment of all the G20 members' emission-related policies across power, fuels, transport, building industry, and circular economy. We look at 130 different metrics. It's a very bottom-up process where we're looking at presence of policies, their robustness, and their effectiveness. In the interest of time, I will give you the summary result. This is based on the assessment this year. The arrows indicate whether there has been an improvement or a lack of progress compared to the last year. You can see that the European members of G20 as a whole do relatively well, in particular Germany, France, and the UK. They are the top scorers. Across the board, these are the countries that have implemented policies that are really helping them with decarbonization. Of course, in the short term, because of the current energy crisis, there have been some challenges, particularly around resurgence of thermal coal usage in Europe due to lack of Russian gas supplies. But we do expect these countries that, putting aside the current geopolitical conflict, they will continue to do well in terms of decarbonization within this decade. When we look outside of the European members of G20, actually South Korea stands out. You can see that South Korea is doing relatively well. However, unfortunately, there has been some decline compared to its prior performance. Now, part of this challenge has been, to be very frank, the change in government. The prior government had a much more pro-renewable stance. Unfortunately, it had a probably a little bit of a too strong anti-nuclear stance, which did have some short-term impact on Korea's emissions. But under the new government, unfortunately, there's quite a lot of concerns around how much level of support there will be for renewables, particularly when it comes to the solar sector. If you look beyond Korea across the rest of APAC, you can see that the OECD members of APAC do relatively okay. So Japan and Australia also doing relatively well. But then you can see that actually India, Indonesia, and China are relatively scored poorly. Now, the one area that I do want to highlight, as I've mentioned a few times already, is the power sector. Power sector is the one that, particularly for Korea, is critical if the country wants to get its emissions under control. Currently, when you look at the share of zero emission electricity supply in Korea's electricity mix, it's relatively lower compared to European members of G20. So if you look at France, UK, and Germany, they already have far higher zero emission electricity supply. And if you look at the 2030 targets, Korea's target is also relatively modest. And this target is under the current government, which is formally adopting its next basically electricity plan this month, is unlikely to be ratcheted up. Now, the problem with having low share of zero emission electricity supply is that it affects your other sectors of the economy. So for example, one area which Korea historically has been quite strong, battery manufacturing. If you want to reduce emissions from your battery manufacturing, you have to make sure that you have very low emission electricity. What this chart is showing you is if you compare the carbon footprint of manufacturing a 100 kilowatt hour nickel manganese cobalt battery pack in different markets based on their electricity grid emission rate, you can see that the emissions associated with producing that battery in South Korea is much higher than, say, if you were doing it somewhere like Norway or France. And this issue will become increasingly important as, for example, in the case of the EU, there's now more and more measures towards adopting life cycle assessments for various sectors, particularly when it comes to the auto sector. Of course, this also links to the whole debate around the carbon border adjustment mechanism. On a related note, we do also look at the entire global battery supply chain, and we look at other factors. When you take into account other factors, globally, Korea right now is ranked 6th. You can see that when it comes to battery manufacturing itself, is actually ranked number 2 because obviously it has a very strong position historically. But then when you look at other factors such as the environmental performance of manufacturing, then the ranking is a lot lower. Moving beyond power, there are other key climate action priority areas that the G20 countries have been discussing. There are 3 key ones around fossil fuel subsidy phase out, carbon pricing, as well as climate risk disclosure. When it comes to fossil fuel subsidy phase out, this was another contentious point during COP27 as well as COP26. In COP26 in Glasgow, there was a tortuous language around phasing out inefficient subsidies. In reality, if you look at the amount of fossil fuel support that G20 members still provide, it's quite substantial. So over the 5-year period from 2016 to 2020, this was about $3.2 trillion. And I'm talking about support, so this is in the form of tax breaks and rebates to consumers. You can see that the large chunk of support comes from, again, developing economies. In cases of Saudi Arabia or India, a lot of this has got to do with underpricing the sales of fossil fuels to consumers. But also other countries such as Korea provide some of these incentives, for example, in the form of reducing the tax on gasoline retail as energy prices went up. This year, unfortunately, the numbers actually, apologies, in 2021, the numbers actually jumped by 16%, partly because many G20 members were trying to fight against the inflation. So they actually started providing more tax breaks as well as subsidies to consumers to soften the blow as in the second half of last year, fossil fuel prices went up. The challenge with this is really not efficient economically. If you're subsidizing fossil fuel usage, you're essentially subsidizing demand at a time constraint, which means effectively you're promoting more demand, which is not the way to tackle the inflationary pressure that's being caused. It would have been much more effective if instead of directly, for example, in the case of Korea, instead of reducing the gas tax, if the government had provided cash transfers to low-income families, that would have had much more positive economic impact without actually boosting more demand. What you really want in cases like this is actually to somehow incentivize consumers to reduce demand, so that that would overall have an impact around reducing prices. Another area that's very important is around pricing emissions. So you could either put in a carbon tax or have an emission trading scheme. 12 of the G20 members have some sort of pricing mechanisms around carbon. Unfortunately, these pricing mechanisms are not all as effective. Both the EU and Korea, as many of you are aware, have a very well-functioning emission trading scheme, and the prices on the emission trading scheme in both countries have. The challenge in the Korean case, though, is that there are still too to the companies that are required to comply. So under Korea's ETS, currently still 90% of the emission allocations are given for free, whereas in the case of the EU, actually that share has been significantly reduced over time. So this is another area that Korea will need to consider if it wants to use its emission trading scheme as a way to hit its emission reduction targets. The last one is around climate risk disclosure. A little background on this topic. Many of you may have heard of the acronym TCFD, or the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Risk Disclosure. Came up in the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2007-2008. The whole G20 concept, as many of you will be familiar with, really accelerated after the global financial crisis. At that time, the Financial Stability Board of G20 decided to actually set up a new committee to look at potential risks to the global financial system as a result of climate change. This became the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which was initially chaired by the Governor Bank of England at the time, Mark Carney, as well as actually Bloomberg founder Mike Bloomberg was also the co-chair. Over time, the TCFD involved a lot of different public and private institutions to come up with recommendations around how companies can go about disclosing their potential risks associated with climate change. These could be different forms of risks. So for example, you may have physical risks. So if you're an insurance company and as a result of climate change, there's more floods and more droughts, then you may have to pay out more. So that physical risk is quite important. But there could be other types of financial or reputational risks. So for example, if you're an electric utility and you have a lot of coal power plants, or if you're an oil and gas company, and if there's more and more pressures on investors to divest from fossil fuels, then there's a reputational risk. There's also transition risks. So for example, as the adaptation and mitigation measures accelerate, then if you're a car manufacturer and more consumers switch to EVs, but you're only selling internal combustion engine vehicles, then you have that transition risk as well. Long story short, the TCFD came up with a set of recommendations around how companies can approach in communicating their risk exposures to investors. And we've now started to see some countries actually either require as a mandatory requirement or highly recommend using the TCFD recommendations for listed companies. Among the G20 members, the European members have been leading around sort of risk disclosure for climate change. Here in Asia Pacific, Japan had a group that really pushed for adopting TCFD recommendations, although they're not mandatory always, but they're highly recommended. And Korea is also considering actually more and more pushing for companies to use TCFD recommendations. The idea here is that as more companies actually improve risk disclosures, then investors get better at pricing that risk, And then as the climate risks become priced better, then there will be more action and more investment towards adaptation and mitigation. I've already spoken a lot, so this will be my last slide. In conclusion, when we look at comparing Korea and the EU, the very first area that Korea still lacks compared to the EU is energy market reforms. If you look at the share of zero-emission electricity in the EU as a whole, that number is really high, not just because European countries such as Germany and others adopted really generous policies towards renewables a long time ago, but it's more because European countries actually implemented energy market reforms a long time ago. So the third EU energy package actually was very important in terms of making the power market more competitive and more accessible to renewables. I'm not saying that the EU doesn't have its own problems. Of course, today, the EU faces a crisis, and some of these are challenges due to political decisions that were made over a decade ago. But as a whole, looking at the power market regulations in the EU and comparing them to Korea, there are a lot of good lessons for Korea to learn from the EU, particularly around the third energy package. The second one is around the emission trading scheme. Again, Korea actually did model the K-ETS after EU ETS. The challenge is, and now the EU ETS is functioning more as a mechanism to actually promote emission reduction, whereas the K-ETS still is not really giving the right price signals to reduce emissions. So we haven't really seen K-ETS be effective in driving emissions down yet. The final one is around government R&D. In the interest of time, I didn't go through it too much. If you look at the share of R&D spending around climate change technologies and energy transition technologies, actually both Korea and EU do really well. The difference is that the EU has done a better job of targeting its R&D funding around basic research and areas where private sector on its own cannot do. Whereas in Korea, a lot of times actually the subsidies have an inflationary impact, and in effect, they can crowd out money that private investors could bring in, or they're simply, in economic terms, are not efficient. One of those examples I'd like to give is around subsidies for fuel cell vehicles and electric vehicles. Initially, subsidies are important for driving consumer adoption, but at some point, the subsidies become too large of a burden on the state budget, and it becomes much more effective to use emission standards as the EU has done, for example, in driving adoption. In the case of Korea, both under the previous government and the current government, the subsidies to the individual consumers are still really generous, which it may make consumers happy, but from an emission reduction perspective is actually not a very effective way of using those limited public fundings to promote deployment of emission reduction